Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Google for sponsoring this session. Culture, caste, and religion in India. We can't talk about that at work. My name is Rashmi Vikram, and I'm country manager at Community Business in India. I will be your moderator for this session. India is one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world. Yet, the complexities and sensitivities are such that issues relating to culture, caste, and religion are rarely openly discussed, let alone addressed in the Indian workplace. In this session, we build on the theme of global thought leader Mary Frances Winter's book, We Can't Talk About That at Work, to facilitate a bold conversation about culture, caste, and religion in India. Bringing together global and Indian experts, we will discuss the sensitivities around these issues, explore the ways in which they impact the workplace, and also point to how companies can adopt a more positive and proactive approach. I'm thrilled to introduce the speakers for our panel discussion today. First of all, Mary Frances Winters. She's the founder and president of the Winters Group, a 30-year-old diversity and inclusion consulting firm serving clients in the for-profit and not-for-profit sectors. She's the author of 4 books. We Can't Talk About That at Work, How to Talk About Race, Religion, Politics, and Other Polarizing Topics. I like the topic of her second book, which is Only Wet Babies Like Change, Workplace Wisdom from Baby Boomers. The third book is called Inclusion Starts with I, and CEOs Who Get It, Diversity Leadership from the Heart and Soul. I think we can call Mary Frances as a provocateur, someone who provokes conversation and encourages dialogue, and is not afraid to have tough conversations. Welcome, Mary Frances.
Thank you.
Our second speaker, Christina Thomas Dhanraj, is a third-generation Christian Dalit woman from Chennai. Christina is a volunteer consultant for women and minority-led initiatives focusing on social justice, self-determination, and collaborative models of scholarship. She's an experienced strategy consultant, technical researcher, and community organizer. Christina's writing interests lie in the politics of identity, solidarity, and intersectional discourses between caste, gender, religion, race, and sexuality. Christina is currently working in Beijing, China. Welcome, Christina. And lastly, our third speaker, Pooja Shahani. She's the head of talent development for Goldman Sachs in Bangalore. She's responsible for driving the firm's diversity strategy in Bengaluru. She is a CSR and diversity professional with over 5 years of experience. And prior to Goldman Sachs, she worked at Community Business as our country manager. She's a co-author of a publication called Diversity and Inclusion, Building the Business Case Stories from India. Pooja has received the Global Diversity Leadership Award by the World HRD Congress for her contribution in the diversity space in 2015 and 2016. A warm welcome to all the panelists. My first question is going to be for Mary Frances. So Mary Frances, I really loved the title of your book, and that's the one reason why I actually purchased the book as well. So tell us a little bit about your book. We can't talk about that at work. Why did you write it? And also, while talking about that, give us a glimpse in terms of culture and religion, and why is it a sensitive or taboo subject?
So thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's quite an honor. I really appreciate it. I wrote the book because there is so much going on around the world that is polarizing us. We see polarization in politics. We see polarization around religion, Islamophobia. We see anti-Semitism, and we just see lots of different groups that are polarizing and going from very extreme positions. I believe this or I believe this, and there doesn't seem to be any place in between, or a place for us to compromise or for us to actually talk about what our differences are. So I was working with clients who were lamenting that many employees were, coming to work and they had some fears and anxieties about their safety, actually, and not knowing where their coworkers might be feeling and what opinions their coworkers might have, on certain topics. And so when I talked with the publisher, because I had another book in mind and he had wanted me to write on a different topic, and I called him one day and I said, I really think that there's another topic that perhaps I should write about. And he said to me, can you write it in 2 weeks? And I said, no, I don't think I can write a book in 2 weeks. And he said, how about a month? And I said, that would be a little bit of a stretch as well. But the point is that he too, the publisher, Barrett Kohler, thought that this was a very important topic to tackle because of what's going on in our society from a socio-political perspective. And, employees bring their whole selves to work. In our diversity and inclusion space, we invite people to bring their whole selves to work. And so they're bringing their fears, their anxieties, their perspectives, to work. And in some extreme cases, some employees are experiencing trauma related to some of the socio-political climate. As you know, I'm in the United States, but I think that this is global. In Europe, we see anti-Islam kinds of sentiments that are growing, and companies that refuse to allow Muslim workers women to wear the hijab, and those kinds of things. So these are anxiety-producing issues. People tell me that they're afraid to go into the streets because they might be, accosted or attacked because of who they are. And so people bring these anxieties to work, and organizations that are promoters of diversity and inclusion have to understand that employees do bring this to work. And I think that the reason that talking about this is such a taboo topic, race, religion, politics, culture, is that we've been taught not to talk about that. We've been taught not to talk about religion because it can be polarizing, and we don't want employees proselytizing. We don't want people trying to convince others to, join their religions. On the other hand, I think if we're going to create inclusive cultures, then it's important for us to, explore these topics, because these are topics and part of one's identity. And when we begin to talk about identity as a part of what people bring to work. So I think that the reason that we don't talk about it is that we've basically been taught these are not issues that you talk about in the workplace, just work. All you're here to do is to just, do your job. And these outside kinds of topics are not important. But what the social scientists are finding is that these topics really are important to people's well-being. So I think that's why we haven't talked about it. Just historically, we've been taught that that's not a good thing to do.
Thank you, Mary Frances. Christina, my next question is over to you. Mary Frances has actually shared with us some of the dynamics around race and religion from a global or US perspective. And so it would really help us if you can tell us a little bit about the complexities of culture, caste, and religion in India. I'm sure you must have heard many companies stating that caste is not a very diversity issue, and some of them are unwilling to talk about it. Why do you think this is so?
Sure, thank you. In line with what Mary just said, I'm also very happy to be part of this panel today. And like how Pooja had mentioned at the start of the session, it's really important that we start talking about these issues. And I'm guessing further on into the conversation, we'll also talk about why we need to get comfortable about it. But having said that, I think the question that you're raising, Rashmi, is a very important one and a very pertinent one. Because in India, most often the only kinds of diversity issues that we end up talking about is either with regard to gender or age or probably race, because some of us work for multinational corporations, and as Indians we feel like we don't get the same spotlight as our non-Indian counterparts do, and so race also becomes a topic to be talked about. But when it comes to caste or religion, it becomes extremely extremely sensitive, so people don't get to talk about it, and this would have real world implications on the ones who are willing to talk about it, who are even raising such issues in the workplace. But what are the actual complexities? One of my colleagues, as part of the Dalit Women Fight movement that I volunteered to, put this really well. Caste system is what you get when you combine race, class, and religion. So that's the best way to understand the system of caste. But when it actually translates into practical everyday living for us, it doesn't just manifest in these three aspects, but also creates in itself a new entity or a new identity called caste. And also, if we would have to see this as a structure, so you have Brahmins who come first, and then Kshatriyas, and then Vaishyas, and then Shudras. And then outside of this structure, you have the Panchamas, or the untouchables. We collectively call ourselves Dalits. And so this pyramid, or this triangle, determines our access to education, employment, resources, access to networks, access to having a livelihood, access to being respected. So it basically, this top-down pyramid becomes inverted when it comes to our access to anything and everything. So given this complexity and the statistics that close to half of the Dalit population in India, which is half of 250 million of us, if they are all living under the poverty line, and 60% of us are illiterate, 50 to 60% of us are illiterate, imagine the manifestations of this kind of an inequality within the corporate space. Because within the corporate space, we know for a fact that 90% of those who are holding the jobs belong to either, happen to be either Brahmins or Baniyas. And that's a given. That's a given statistic that cannot be debated. So this invariably will give rise to a number of complexities. And that's also one of the reasons why employers and MNCs are not willing to talk about caste, because there's no one to talk about it. So who will be the ones having this conversation? Why would people who are holding on to power and position by virtue of their class and caste and position in the society want to talk about something that could potentially take away that power, right? So they wouldn't want to give up on that privilege. And I think that is one of the main reasons why people don't want to talk about it. So they stick to safer topics. They stick to topics that's not going to create too much of an impact to their own livelihoods, to their own positions. So they're willing to talk about it. The second biggest reason is more structural and systemic, because within the corporate space, within the corporate context, we play to our strengths. We play to what's working best for us. We play to the strength of our networks. We play to our sophisticated skills. We play to our soft skills. Now, all of these, if you think about it, are basic replicas of what we envision white upper caste behavior. Now, to talk about caste would mean that you start questioning all of these parameters. You start questioning all of these so-called indicators that we have for performance and for behavior, right? So I think that would be the second biggest reason why companies are not willing to talk about caste. I hope that answers both of your questions.
It did. And it also made me start to think about some of the other aspects, that came in line with some of the research that we at Community Business were doing as well. And that's to do with the urban and the rural divide here in India. So that also adds to this whole pyramid. And then, there are so many other sections that get added into this conversation. So thank you so much for, bringing in that perspective. I'm going to go ahead and ask a question to Pooja. Pooja, you've heard both our speakers. I just wanted to ask you, what is your reaction first to the conversation between Mary Frances and Christina? And I also wanted to ask you a question around, to what extent do you agree that companies are hesitant to talk about culture and religion in the workplace in India?
Thank you, Rashmi. And once again, thank you to Mary Frances and Christina, for sharing your thoughts. I'm really excited to see and have this discussion with us, because I do believe it's a pertinent discussion to have, especially in today's day and age. Like what Mary Frances said, we do live in a very polarized world today than we did before, and the need to kind of bring people together and have these very honest, candid dialogues of what's happening outside in the world and how we bring all of this into our workplace is quite critical to a company's ability to be inclusive, for a company's ability to perform well in business. I do also agree with Christina that we are talking about these issues. There is sensitivity around talking about these issues, be it caste, be it religion, be it race. In fact, one of the things that I was reading before coming here, there was a recent research publication that came out from Diversity Best Practices, which many of you may have heard. It's something called the Inclusion Index. And as part of that Inclusion Index, they looked at 51 companies and looked at what kind of topics and issues these companies were talking about. Out of the 51 companies, 24% of those companies had employee resource groups that addressed religion. Another data point from that was 82% of those companies, however, had religious accommodations, be it prayer rooms, quiet rooms, or breaks during prayers. And I was looking at this data, and one of the things I was thinking about is, interesting that companies now are at least looking at accommodations, are thinking about it, because I think in some countries there is a legal obligation to, and your equal opportunity policy does sort of ask you to keep that in mind. However, the ability to have an honest conversation and address dialogue like this is still pretty minimal. So we're happy to do the things that exist on the side, but when we want to bring people together, sit on a table, have a discussion about it, address it head on, we might not be ready to do so just yet. In Goldman, we started this journey in 2009, and I'll share a little bit later as to what are some of the things that we've done. But we often get calls from companies in India asking us, why are you talking about religion in the workplace or culture in the workplace? What's the need for it? What's the business case for it? And we spend a lot of time sharing that with them, because we realize that this is something that has benefited us a lot in terms of creating that inclusive culture that will help us be a much more productive workplace than we would otherwise.
Thank you, Pooja, for continuing the dialogue around religion at the workplace, because we realize that these are conversations that need to continue to happen. Otherwise, they just die down. I'm going to go back to Mary Frances and ask a question around, when you're addressing culture, caste, and religion, an important part of diversity and inclusion agenda, is sometimes missed out. So what is the danger of not addressing these issues as part of the diversity and inclusion agendas for organizations?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Pooja, for setting that up, because I think Goldman Sachs is leading the way in recognizing, the importance of having these conversations in the workplace. So I think that we can look at all of the kinds of things that employers would want, and they want greater productivity and greater engagement. And so if I'm afraid and I'm coming to work with some kind of fear that I'm not going to be safe on the outside, it can impact my productivity. I heard a young man, I was doing a focus group, and a young man said, there are 3 strikes against me. He said, I'm Muslim. He said, I'm from the Middle East, and I'm gay. And he said, when I go to the metro station in Washington, D.C., I don't stand near the edge because I'm afraid that somebody might push me in. And so that impacts his ability. He said, and it impacts my ability to do my best work. And so there's, that factor. And, I think that's tied obviously to engagement, and the engagement, is how well does the employee feel that they're connected to the organization. And when they feel connected, they're going to be more productive. And so those two go hand in hand. And I'm going to feel more connected to my organization if I think that they are looking at the whole person, looking at me as a whole person, and recognizing that these issues come up. So oftentimes we find that the employee resource groups, employee network groups, the affinity groups in organizations will oftentimes take the lead in helping leadership to understand how the events are impacting them and their ability to do their best work. Because quite frankly, some people are not impacted. And I've done some other sessions where heterosexual white men have been in the session and they'll say, wow, you know, I'm really shocked that these are fears that people have, because they've never thought about it, because it doesn't really, some of these things don't really impact them. So the social psychologists say that, you know, that this is the last box that I have around psychological safety. And the social psychologists say that when people do not feel psychologically safe, they're less apt to feel that they belong. They're less apt to feel that they're included. And Catalyst actually did a study in Australia which showed that psychological safety impacts one's ability to be innovative. So most organizations, and Pooja talked about that, the business case. And so most organizations obviously want people to be innovative. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? And so I can't be as innovative if in fact these stressors, you know, are on me. Retention. So I was doing work with a very major consulting firm, and the one time that I went in, we had conversation with the Black group, employee resource group, and one of the young men talked about how he came to work one day, and he was quite upset at yet another killing of an unarmed, you know, Black man. And he said that his manager gave him nothing, like not even a, you know, I'm sorry to hear that. You know, what can I do to support you? Apparently, she just didn't know what to say. And this is part of the reason that we don't have the conversation. And part of the reason that I wrote the book is to try to give tips and tools for how do you have these conversations. And so the manager said nothing. So I went back again, and that time I was working with a different group, the Asia Pacific Islander group. But it came up, I was just mentioning that we had this other conversation. And my host said, oh, you know, that young man that stood up and talked about how his manager didn't support him, left the company. And she said, and we did not want to lose him. She said, because he was a really good employee. And they believed that in part, it was because he didn't feel supported, you know, around some of the things that were going on. And then just enhance cross-cultural understanding. When we don't understand one another, why we do things, I think part of the question, you know, that we need to understand is why. You know, why does somebody feel this way? And so when we are able to talk about it, we're not trying to convert somebody and trying to, you know, change their beliefs, as I said earlier, but it just does help to understand. And you've got to find a common ground. So I'll tell a little bit of a story. My sister-in-law is Muslim. And this was many years ago. I've learned since then. So when I tell this story, you're going to say, how could she not know this? But oftentimes we don't know what we don't know, and it precludes us from having the conversation. So I happen to be Christian. My sister-in-law is Muslim. I love my sister-in-law dearly. We have a wonderful, wonderful relationship. But years ago, we never talked about religion because I didn't know anything about Islam. I just didn't know, and I didn't want to offend her. So oftentimes we don't have the conversation because we don't want to offend. And so one day we just happened to be talking, and she mentioned Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I said, oh, you all have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob too? And so it was just that I didn't know. I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I think that we have to find that common ground. We have to find a way to break down the barriers, because I think in an inclusive environment, we do want not to offend someone. We want to be respectful. We're asked to be respectful. And if you don't know, so in the book, I talk about the need for us to gain additional knowledge and understanding and insights about the others who may be in the workplace. And again, it's not to convert anybody, but understanding the caste system can be really helpful for people who are not from India and don't understand, you know, how that might be playing out and the impact that might have on how relationships are being developed or not, you know, in the workplace. So I think for all of these reasons, and in today's climate, like I mentioned earlier, I mean, we are living in such polarized times where there's so many issues that impact people, and they're just the need for organizations that that promote diversity and inclusion, that have that as part of their vision, that have that as part of their business case. It's really important to recognize that we're living in these times. I'm going to be working today because it's early in the morning here in the United States, but I'm going to be working today with a major pharmaceutical company. And the topic is the new normal. And I'm going to be working with the inclusion ambassadors. And the idea is to help these inclusion ambassadors in the company recognize that we are living in a different time, and how do we support them in being able to have these conversations and providing them the tools and the skills to be able to still be respectful of our differences, but also in an attempt to try to come to some kind of common ground.
Thank you, Mary Frances. That word you used around psychological safety is so powerful, and it really resonates with me because we do a lot of work with youngsters, with the elderly, and for anyone, I feel psychological safety is the first step that gives you confidence to be who you are, to communicate in the external world. So that's really powerful, and I really wish that all of us take that into account when we're having conversations within and outside the organization. Christina, it's really interesting, to see how this flows on to the next question that I have for you. And it's around why is it important that we become more comfortable in talking about and addressing these issues in India specifically? And some of the key diversity and inclusion or even exclusion issues relating to culture, caste, and religion that you see in your work as a consultant.
Sure. So first of all, Rashmi, to your first question, I'm going to be honest and frank. I don't think the idea should be for us to get comfortable with it. The idea should be just the opposite, because given the sensitive nature of caste and how it actually translates itself and expresses itself in the society at large, and as well as the corporate, it's never going to be a comfortable topic for us to talk about. We have to be realistic in setting ourselves these goals. That's one thing. The second thing is that as part of that discomfort, there is this question as to why should we talk about caste? I think I'm personally uncomfortable when someone asks me, why should we talk about gender? And then people go like, oh, let's create a business case for why gender is important for D&I, because business case is the language of how corporates work. And so therefore, let's create a business case. But basically, ultimately, the only business case that I can talk about is that I'm human and I deserve to have a good life and I deserve to have fullness of humanity just like anyone else. And so then comes the question, if we are willing to talk about gender, if we have taken so much effort to create an actual business case with clear-cut parameters as to why that works, why haven't we taken that effort when it comes to caste, despite caste being the one that defines our very society in India? So there's clearly a lot of hesitation that's coming from people's, from the management or from even people within the organization. Again, it comes back to the point that there's not many of us who are willing to have that conversation. But still going back and asking ourselves why we need to be talking about caste, it goes back to why we need to talk about gender, talent, like
I think there's a slight lag in the video transcription that is coming from Christina. I'm going to go ahead and ask the next question to Pooja while we have Christina back on the line. So Pooja, Christina was talking to us around the topic of addressing issues at the workplace. So wanted to ask you in terms of what are the ways in which culture and religion show up at your workplace? How does it impact organizational dynamics and business performance?
Sure. So I really wanted to continue listening to Christina to see what else I could have picked out of that. But I think, both Mary obviously very nicely put it up on a slide. And I think, I have nothing else to add to that. But Christina, are you back? She's not back yet. And one of the things that I just wanted to add to this piece is actually the biases piece, that biases exist in all throughout our employee life cycle, from hiring to retention to development. And those biases are very explicit, but they're also very unconscious. So we don't necessarily know what we are doing and what we are thinking and how we're making decisions based on that. And I think that exists throughout. It will exist in the way team dynamics play out. It will exist in the way lunch conversations are happening, or water cooler conversations are happening. It will also very clearly come across in some cases in terms of how teams are built. We live in a country where language, when someone speaks a language, and you slowly realize that, oh, teams are forming or friendships are forming based on those language, how does it then feel to individuals who don't necessarily fit in? Productivity and performance, I think, is obviously a very, very big sort of metric for companies, given, we're all about data, and we look at that data, and we want to be able to address the questions based on that data. But there was a study that came out from Cumulative Gallup that looked at, in inclusive teams where people felt more inclusive, there was a jump of 22% in productivity. And going back to Christina's point that we are all human, we go to work, we spend 10 hours at work, we want to be productive, we want to feel like we achieved something at the end of the day, but also our environment needs to be conducive enough and safe enough for us to be able to feel that way and to be able to be as productive that way. So I think all of those pieces come into play. The informal side, which is the lunch conversations, the water cooler conversations, the friendships, your ability to form relationships in the workplace. I think sometimes we as companies don't give that so much of a credit or so much importance, but I think it's critical to an employee's experience in the workplace. So in order for us to create an inclusive workplace, we need to be addressing these topics. And I completely agree that we need an open space to have this conversation and feel uncomfortable. But I'm also thinking about the fact that we want to create an environment where if I'm uncomfortable, I can tell you I'm uncomfortable with that conversation. So let's sit down and let's understand why I'm uncomfortable or why I'm uncomfortable. And that, to me, is something maybe idealistic. It'll take us many years to reach there. I don't know. But I do feel that there's a level of progress that we're making. Slowly, the optimistic in me feels that we are making some progress. And we are more aware of some of those biases than we ever were before.
Thank you, Pooja. And we have Christina back online right now. And while we were talking to Christina and we were hearing, the comment around the uncomfortable conversation, one of the points that came into my mind was one of the earlier managers that I used to work for, when I asked him about how do we work with LGBT, individuals in the workplace, and it was a topic that was never raised in our organization at that time. He said, just go ahead and have those courageous conversations. He called them courageous conversations and said, go for it and then see what happens. So over to you, Christina.
Can you still hear me / see me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay. So I will go back to the question that I was answering. So I will finish with that and then get into, the issues that you were talking about and you had wanted me to pinpoint on. So again, talent is important. The industry as such is definitely facing a talent crunch. We want the right kind of talent, a unique kind of talent. We want ideas from everywhere. And who knows, our lived experiences will definitely contribute and shape the ideas that we bring into the organization. And secondly, like Mary had mentioned very early in the conversation, we live in a diverse world. We are having conversations that are very politically charged. I mean, everyone's political today. I mean, gone are the days when, people found it super fashionable to say, oh, I'm so not into politics. No more. Everyone's having political conversations. Everyone's having conversations about identity and diversity and, whatnot. So our leaders need to be aware of this. Like, you can't just have, the quintessential white old man sitting, being the CEO or being part of the C-suite. We want different kinds of people who can have different kinds of conversations, who can evoke passion in just about anyone. I personally find amazing leaders even within my organization who's having these kinds of conversations, and I find them to be my biggest role models. Like I think of them when I want to think of what I want to be eventually. So absolutely, I mean, these are some of the reasons why we need to be having these conversations, especially about caste, because that is the defining hierarchical feature in India. But more importantly, what are some of the issues as first generation Dalits that we face within the corporate space? Is that one is that I've mentioned this already, these access to networks. My biggest challenge has always been this. It's not so much about work and merit, because that is a milestone we are crossing as we speak. Like, I finished my university, a number of my peers have, Dalit peers have. So really, it's not so much about merit. And I will go back to Pooja's point about these water cooler conversations, these casual conversations. We don't take these seriously enough, but these are the ones that really actually define and determine your growth in an organization. And speaking out is looked down upon. Anything that's against the majority view is looked down upon. And D&I is continue to be seen as a silo conversation. You know what I mean? So business is always kept separate. D&I is kept separate, and then decisions are kept separate. So we need to be having conversations that includes and involves everything. We can't be talking about, having a very diverse culture and including people, and then say networking is super important. Having friends in the right places is super important. Having connections is super. We can't be having these conversations at the same time. They are in tension with each other. They are working against each other. So if you're talking about D&I, we have to have honest conversations about how people grow in the organization. And yeah, so I wouldn't want to use the word, but we know what we're talking about. We can't keep, sucking up to people to get positions. And that sucking up is actually happening by virtue of the class and the caste and the network that you belong to. And that needs to stop.
So really important that, as part of this whole conversation, we try and break these silos that we see around us and see how we could work this across the organizations. And we really hope that the conference today will really help people to have these conversations at their organizations. I'm going to quickly go back to Mary Frances. This is again a reference to your book, Mary Frances, in which you talk about the importance of bold, inclusive conversations. How can companies or managers facilitate these conversations in a way that is really appropriate? What has been some of the positive impacts of this approach, that you have shown?
Thank you. So I think that obviously we're all saying that it's really, really important to have these conversations. But in the book, I point out that it's not easy to have the conversations and that we need to have the skill. So I don't know that I agree with the advice that you were given around LGBT. Just go and have the conversation. Just start to talk about it. I think that there are some prerequisites to having the conversation to make the conversation effective. So, number one, you want to know that both parties, want to have the conversation. So there's the desire, we're talking about the importance of it, but the people that we want to have the conversation with may not see the importance, as has already been said. But I think that this really is about building a competency and a capability. And so the first step is to really focus on self. How do I identify in terms of my culture, in terms of my values and my beliefs? What are my own biases? Pooja mentioned that, really looking at our own biases. What are my triggers? What are those things that are going to cause me to have anger or anxiety if I talk about that because of the experience perhaps that I've had? So we've worked with organizations where we've worked first with affinity groups, first with, the Latino group or the women's group or whatnot, to really understand what some of those self-identifying characteristics might be that others might not understand or that might be important for you. But if you're talking to a middle-aged white male, it might not be important, or he might not resonate with why those kinds of things are important to you. Just like the young man who was concerned about the killing of more Black men, but for his boss, it wasn't anything that she could actually talk about. So first of all, we have to focus on self. And I don't recommend that we sit down and have a conversation if we're in a state of high emotion, about something. We really have to go back and reflect. So this is about reflecting and learning. And we don't know a lot about others. We really don't know. Like my example of my sister-in-law, right? And so how much do I know about the other position, the other point of view, the other group, and from their perspective? So focusing on that can help you to assess your readiness. And so in the book, I've got a little chart that talks about, am I even ready to have the conversation? So first of all, I don't recommend that we sit down and talk about caste, religion, race, politics, or any of that unless we're ready. We've done some pre-work. And then preparing for the conversation. We talked about water cooler. So if some of these contentious issues come up at the water cooler, I don't recommend that we continue to have those conversations at the water cooler. I recommend that we pause and we say, you know, this is a really important discussion. Let's do some preparation and let's come back and have this discussion at another time. Because that, obviously, if it's at the water cooler and there's polarization, I feel this way, you feel this way, it can perhaps lead to some unnecessary conflict, you know, in the workplace. And so the preparation is, you know, where are we having it? Who's involved in the conversation? Do we need to bring in HR? Is it something that is, you know, has escalated? Or is this a conversation that we just want to have ourselves? So all of those kinds of things in terms of preparing for the conversation. And in those first conversations, what you really want to do is you want to create shared meaning, all right? So shared meaning for me, and with my sister-in-law's example, was we shared Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, okay? They're in the Bible, they're in the Quran as well. I didn't know that. But now we've got a place where we can begin to talk because we've created some shared meaning. So shared meaning might be we all want to be safe. You know, shared meaning might be that we all care about this company and we all want the company to achieve its goals. So whatever that shared meaning is, you've really got to get there first before you can begin to interpret the differences. And so, and I'll also talk a lot about interpretation. So I say safety, and that might mean something very different to someone else when we say safety. So we really have to get down to what are the behaviors? What do we really mean? What do we really mean when we say inclusive? What do we really mean? Because these are all big words. So those conversations first we have to get to that common ground so that we share an understanding of even what we're talking about. We have to know when to pause the conversation and say, you know what? We're really not moving forward here. Let's go and reflect on this and let's learn something. Let me go and learn some more facts, because one of the things that happens is when we're trying to have these conversations, oftentimes people have their own perceptions and opinions, but they're not always based in fact. They have their truth, but that might not be the truth or the only truth. And so the idea about having these conversations is that it's not a one and done. We just don't have one. And that we're creating a space for ongoing dialogue, and we're creating an opportunity for people to be able to, one of the things we talked about is how can you be honest in terms of how you're feeling. And one approach is the ouch approach. So if somebody says something that's really offensive or whatnot, we're able to say, ooh, ouch, and then have the dialogue, because we have to assume positive intent. You have to assume the person didn't mean to offend, but we have to have a way and a shared meaning, again, a shared meaning of what we're going to do when that uncomfortable situations happen. And I agree that if we don't get uncomfortable, we're not going to move forward. So the discomfort is part of the conversation, but we have to have a way to process that discomfort. And that's maybe in the, ooh, ouch, that hurt. Now let's talk about why that hurt. So you're giving people that, the space to do that. But the idea is that the model basically says that you have to build a skill. You have to know if you're ready. You have to have the conducive environment to have the conversations. And you have to recognize that you may not come to closure in one conversation. It may take several conversations, and you have to be willing to pause, reflect, and learn, and then go back to the conversation.
There are so many keywords that I'm picking up from this conversation here: shared meaning, interpretations, knowing the other side, and I want to just connect this to my next question to Pooja. In terms of, what the approach has been for your company to address culture and religion in India. Are there some examples that you could share with us in terms of networks, awareness, or training that has been conducted? And a little bit around the positive impact of the approach as well.
Great. Thanks, Rashmi. So, there are a couple of ways in which that we've approached this at Goldman in India in specific. One, obviously, inclusive policies, like I mentioned, having those policies and stating very clearly what those policies are, what those policies cover, not really hiding away from it. Sometimes, for example, we just say, we have an equal opportunity policy, but we don't call things out. So the ability to call things out and what is actually covered under these policies is something that we've been very articulate and clear about. The other piece that I definitely want to share, because it's unique for us here in India, is our employee resource group that specifically looks at religion and culture. So it's called the India Religion and Culture Forum. It started in 2009 with the impetus that actually we do bring religion and culture to our workplace, and we realized that there was nowhere where we could discuss it. There was nowhere where we could even engage in a dialogue or even raise our own awareness about this. So the interest forum was formed in 2009, which is quite early on. Some of the objectives for this particular interest forum were things like to advocate for an inclusive workplace where you respected each individual and what they brought to the table. The second thing was to really ensure that people understood some of the stereotype and preconceived notions that we had about certain aspects of our society, be it language, be it caste, be it culture, be it religion. So what are some of the stereotypes that we're playing with and that exist? And we're not necessarily consciously aware of, but we know they exist. The third piece was to help create a conducive and safe environment where people could bring their whole selves to work, or at least not the most amount of their selves to work, because sometimes we do leave some things out of work. So, that was the objective with which we started this forum. And I have to say that it's been quite amazing to watch the journey. Obviously, creating a space where some people can have this, their sensitive dialogue. There's a lot of apprehension. A lot of the work that we started with was just engagement. Let's do some cultural activities. Let's just talk about what's different in all of our cultures. Let's talk about what's different in terms of language, and slowly started to experiment with a little more. So for example, we did sessions where we were sensitizing our employees on certain myths or stereotypes that we have about certain individuals or certain religions or certain castes. Every year in the month of May, we celebrate sort of religious differences and similarities in some sense, because there are a lot of similarities as well. What we do is we bring together speakers, expert speakers, we bring together panels. So for example, just to give you a look inside what normally happens, when we first started, we did some sessions around Islamic banking, because Goldman being an investment firm, we probably never really engaged in Islamic banking. What is that about? What does this mean for our business? How is it different? Some other things that we've talked about are, we invited a professor from IIM Bangalore to talk about the social capital of caste, and looking at caste from a very difficult viewpoint than we would have otherwise. And this was kind of shifting the dialogue. And that started a lot of dialogue internally, because normally you don't talk about caste. And here we were on a platform talking about research on the social capital of caste. So, it engages people, it gets people excited. We've also done things like, what are the dynamics of intercultural marriages? Because we are in a workplace where we meet people from across cultures. What does this mean in terms of bringing different cultures together in a marriage and a family? So these are some of the things we do. But besides that, actually, this interest forum is also very closely connected with what we do strategically. So they were the interest forum that helped us get quiet rooms across locations in India to ensure that there was a space for individuals when they wanted to go pray and take some time to meditate. So there would be a designated quiet room. This particular group also advises the firm in terms of annual holidays. So is there diversity in the kind of holidays that we're providing to our employees every year? Do we provide the same holidays, or are we choosing different holidays? Because we know in India that we have many holidays to choose from. So, what is that process? So there's been a lot of thought around what this group of individuals, who are extremely passionate individuals, who you talk about it and want to talk about it and have
Pooja, you're speaking on mute.
Can you hear me now? Where did I sort of fizzle away? At what point?
So you were just talking to us about the functions at the workplace, and suddenly it got cut off.
Okay, great. So you heard me talking about the holidays and the calendars, yes? Okay, great. So in terms of the impact it has on the workplace, we've been trying to figure out how this group actually impacts the broader employee base, and we've been able to see that on a yearly basis, this group touches around 1,500 people just by the events that they're doing, the more business unit driven events that they're doing, the conversations that they're having. So clearly, if anything, it has raised some awareness on this dialogue, and it has provided that space. Besides that, I think we have definitely seen an increase in just people being more comfortable talking about their needs and their accommodations, be it, okay, I'm fasting today and I need to go pray 5 times a day. So just informing the manager and saying like, hey, and most of the times our managers even know because those conversations have continued. So creating that environment where that openness exists, that inclusive culture exists as much as possible. I'm not going to say that we have it all or we've done it all correctly and we're very successful. We have a long way to go still. The other piece where it's actually really supported us is in our branding internally and externally. Many people outside are aware of the work that we're doing. It provides us with an opportunity to brand ourselves as an inclusive employer. A lot of these case studies have been published outside. A lot of our employees tell us themselves in the surveys that we do that, hey, I really enjoy working here because I learn so much. It gives me an opportunity to understand and talk to people. And I think that's the whole work, the experience of coming to work that we're trying to address and at least uplift in the ways that we can.
Thank you, Pooja. With 10 minutes to go for the session to end, I'm going to open this up for Q&A. And I already see that we have one question for Christina. Christina, this question talks about the upper caste leftist liberals who occupy positions of power, especially top management, believe that caste system was in the past and that new modern India should not even engage or talk about it. How does one bring caste conversation into this setup, and how have you managed to bring this up in your workplace?
Well, to be honest, I haven't managed. I have failed at it. Like I said, there's very little power for just a few of us Dalits in the context, in the sphere to start this conversation, which is why we need to have allies. And the only thing that I think I've been successful in doing is making sure that these informal conversations are happening. I'm not really sure if I followed Mary's model, but I only take that as a gift for me to follow eventually. And I think that's a great model. And my most favorite part of that model is assessing readiness, to really ask yourself if you're ready to have this kind of conversation, because having these conversations can also have a huge impact on your mental health, as well as your growth in the company. So you need to know how to do it, and you have to be ready to do it as well. And I don't think I had taken that much I don't think I had done that much of an assessment with regard to both my mental health as well as with regard to my growth. So I had gone ahead and had these conversations. In the long run, I think it would help, but at least within my small pockets, I've been able to create impact. Like if people talk about even the most generic social issues, like I talk about caste because it's important for me to talk about it, because that defines my living, that defines my lived experience. So I am being very unfair to myself and inauthentic if I'm not going to talk about caste. So I do it, but it's all happening in a very informal, in a very small scale way. What will help is that if you have contacts in the D&I team, if you have friends in the right kinds of places, then you can start these conversations, and hopefully your D&I focal points will be more receptive.
Thank you. We have one more question that's come through chat. It says, does any company have a program that focuses on employees who come from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, not referring to CSR programs, but more work done in-house? This is open to any of our panelists.
I do know of Zoho. My sister works for this company, and I'm not so, I don't know if I'm completely right about it, but I've heard that they do have a program where they specifically pick folks who come from socially disadvantaged backgrounds or financially challenged backgrounds, and they train them for a few years, and they typically post them in on-site locations where they can gain a lot of experience. And for Mary's reference, on-site locations are typically outside of India. So that kind of gives them a huge leap in terms of experience and exposure. So that's one example I know of. But, and I think there's also an article on Fortune India. I'm not very sure which company, but if you could go back to those, go back to that article, it's fairly simple. If you just Google corporate and caste, that article should come up, and it does cite a few examples of companies who do this kind of work. And I think that's a fantastic initiative. Although it circumvents talking about caste, it still does the job.
Thank you, Christina. We will surely look that up and share with the audience so that they can engage in this conversation ahead. Before we close, I just want to ask if there is any last piece of advice, both from Mary Frances and Pooja Shahani, to our audience.
It's been an honor to be a part of this panel today. I've learned a great deal as well. I think that panels such as this help us to not necessarily become more comfortable with the conversation, but raise the awareness of the need. And I think that we just have to keep doing this, because this is a process. It is developmental, and everybody is not ready. But the more we talk about the need to talk about it, we're going to now then have more of the opportunity and more people saying, yes, let's figure out a way to do it. And again, the reason that I wrote that book is to say, you know, really let's look at this from a process perspective, and let's just not sit down and start talking about things that perhaps we don't know much about, or that we're knowing that they're already polarized. And so first, let's figure out a way that we can come to some kind of a common ground so that we can have meaningful dialogue, because we've been talking about these issues for years and years and years. And I think the time is now, because of what we're seeing in the world being so polarized. I think that we must figure out a way to talk about the issues that have been previously taboo. So thank you for the opportunity today.
Yeah. I'd echo what Mary's saying, but in terms of, you know, what I just want to leave all of our listeners with is the idea of challenging ourselves as well. You know, whenever we think that, oh, religion is not a concern in the workplace, race is not, caste is not, let's just pause and ask ourselves, is it not? Let's just take a moment to really do some research and talk to people about, okay, do you know, like, does this happen? Does it not happen? Just take the moment to evaluate, because I think what we'll find more and more is that these are issues, and now that we've started to engage with them, we have to actually do something about it. I would completely echo Mary that we've talked about this for many, many years. I think action is something, and being accountable to our words is something that we need to be sort of more mindful of, and really hold ourselves accountable. To my fellow D&I colleagues who are listening to this, take the opportunity, I think, for all of us to just ponder upon this and reflect and see whether there's a way in which we can start these dialogues internally in our own organizations in some form or another. Small, large, we can do it, but, you know, let's at least start to do it.
Thank you, Pooja. You know, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of today's session. I'd like to take a moment to thank again our panelists, Mary Frances Winters, Christina Thomas, Dhanaraj, and Pooja Shahani, for sharing their time and expertise with us today. And thank you also to our audience for your participation and your insightful questions. Please be reminded that this session is recorded, so it's going to be available for download for 30 days. So if you found it useful, we encourage you to share it with your network. Have a fantastic day ahead. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.